adventures this week. My name is Kylynn, and I'm so excited for this week's adventure because we're going to delve into the wonderful world of worms together. In front of me I have my own worm composting bin that I've been using for the past couple of years, and I'm going to explain why they're so fun and so interesting and how you can make one at home or in your classroom. Worm composting is the practice of keeping and feeding red earthworms your leftover fruit and vegetable scraps. So it's a great way to recycle your foods, as well as add a wonderful nutrient-dense worm castings or worm poop into your garden or into your flowers or the plants that you keep at home. If you're like me, you may have started a garden during shelter in place, and a worm bin is a wonderful addition to any garden. Also, now more than ever, we understand how important it is to lead a sustainable lifestyle, and especially when it comes to food, to know where our foods are coming from, and if possible, grow some of our own foods at home. I also encourage teachers to use a worm bin in their classrooms to teach students that worms are not yucky little pink wriggling things that we should step on, but instead they're so important to a healthy ecosystem. And you can also utilize this opportunity to teach students about the cycle of life. Not only do worms add wonderful beneficial nutrients to the soil for vegetables and plants of all kinds, but they also are effective at aerating the soil. That means they make pockets of air as they go through the soil that prevents the soil from getting compacted and allows roots to better grow in that type of soil. So if possible, I'd encourage you to start a small worm bin in your classroom. I'm going to teach you how to do it. And then if you're worried about what you should do with your worms at the end of the school year, or if you no longer want them in your classroom, you can definitely donate your worms and your compost to our shelter, where we'll utilize the compost in our garden, and we'll also use the worms to feed some of our exotic animals and wildlife. Okay, it is time to build your own worm bin. So let's talk about what kind of container you're going to keep them in. The container that they live in can be as simple as a bucket or something more complex like what I have here. And this is important because any water can drain through this surface right here in the wire. And worms live in a really moist environment, but if it gets too moist or too wet, they can drown. So any water that's added needs to be able to drain off. Keep that in mind. You don't want to let them get too wet. So to make sure your worms don't fall through the grate right here, I'm going to add some newspaper. You can also add a paper bag. That's a good stiff surface so they don't fall through as well. Now, the next thing you're going to add is some kind of carbon for them. And my favorite thing is dried leaves. You can also add more strips of newspaper. They will eat the newspaper, but I like to add leaves instead because I have to scoop them up off of my yard anyway. And these also add lots of air pockets for the worms to thrive around. Now the next thing is your vegetable and fruit matter. And I have some broccoli, some broccoli stems here that I wasn't going to eat. So I'll sprinkle these around. I also have some potato peels. This is a good thing to add to your worm bin. I have some old plums that have gone bad that I'm going to drop in there, as well as some old green beans. So anything fruity and vegetables are great to add into your worm bin. And then also, since most of you know that I have Chewy, the rabbit, living at home with me, I like to harvest his poop from his litter box and feed that to the worms as well. So that's a great source of nitrogen. But if you're going to feed poop of any kind to your worms, it needs to be from an herbivore. So cow poop, horse poop, or rabbit poop works really well. It should also be really dry. So I leave this in the sun for a couple of days to make sure it gets really dried out. I would never feed them fresh poop. And I sprinkle that throughout there. And now you are ready to add your worms. Once we put the worms in here, then we're going to give them a little bit of water because this isn't a very moist environment yet. So let's go ahead and get the wormies. let's talk about how you can harvest your worms. There's two ways that you can harvest. One is a lot of fun, especially if you have a classroom full of kids, and that is to just take your worm compost, dump it out onto a huge sheet of plastic or newspaper, and sift through with your hands like I'm doing here and pick out all the worms and separate them from the soil. This is really fun for kids to do. Or the other way you can separate your worms from the compost so you can use it in your garden is to wait until they've eaten down all of their plant matter. So you can see mine still have a ways to go. And then you can push all of your compost off to one side and fill the other side of your container with your new compost, like your new vegetables and your new fruit and your new leaves. And then when they're done finishing their old compost, they'll all work their way over and start feeding on the new compost. So those are two easy ways to separate your worms from your worm castings. Personally, I like to dig through my compost with my hands and separate all the worms, so that gives me a good idea how many worms I have, how healthy they are, and how many eggs they're laying. So I want to find a couple of worm eggs to show you. Here's some worm eggs. And these are really cool because a couple of little worms will hatch from each egg. And this is a really fun thing for kids to watch and learn from. Okay, now it's time to use your compost, and there's two great ways that you can utilize this nutrient-dense compost. So the first way is to, of course, just mix your compost straight in with your garden soil. You can save it and use it at a later time, or you can use it when it's fresh. The second way to use it is to make what we call compost tea, and that means you just scoop a little bit of the compost into some kind of mesh bag to filter it, like so. And then you submerge that in water, and you can leave it for as long as you want. The longer the better. And that kind of steeps all of the nutrients out of the soil, and it drains into the water. I'm gonna kind of filter that out, and you can see that the water is now full of all of that compost nutrients. And this is a great way that you can pour this onto house plants. Instead of mixing the soil in with your soil, you can just water your plants with this instead, and it's really, really good for them. So we have made a worm compost bin together, and on the bottom I have my old worms who are still working on their old compost, and then I made a new level of compost here with fresh material and added some worms to it. And last but not least, I have a blue lid on top, and that's important because you'll find if you keep your worms in the yard, there are critters who would like to eat them, like raccoons or birds. So you do need to keep a secure lid on top of them, and you also need to keep them in the shade because they do live underground, of course, and they need a nice cool environment, so don't let any sun access them. You'll also find that sometimes if you keep a worm bin, you'll notice other critters inside living with your worms, and that might be slugs or roly-polies, and those are totally fine. They add their own nutrients to your soil. But you want to keep an eye out for ants and flies. If you notice ants crawling around on your soil, that means your soil is too dry and you need to be adding a little bit more water to it. And if you notice flies, that could mean your soil is too wet, or you're not doing a good job burying your fruits and vegetables underneath the compost level. So you never want to throw your fruits and veggies just on top of the soil because they will either start to mold or they'll attract some flies to them. So instead, do a good job burying them under the levels of or the layers of compost, so they're nice and hidden down there and the worms can access them easily. I had so much fun making this episode for you, and I hope that you have a wonderful time experimenting with your own worm bin at home. I'll see everybody next week with a brand new animal adventure.